You ever wonder why the people you care about the most seem to push you away the hardest? Why every time things start to get close, they vanish, go silent, shut down? It's not you. It's not because you're too much or not enough. It's because connection feels like danger to someone who's wired to run from it. And here's the truth. No one tells you. Avoidants don't hate love. They fear it. They've been trained by life to survive, not to connect. But there is a way through. There's one shift that flips the entire dynamic, and when you make it, everything changes. They stop running. They stop hiding. They finally feel safe enough to stay. Let's talk about what that shift is and how you can lead it. When someone with avoidant tendencies starts to pull away from you, it's easy to take it personally. Their distance, silence, or sudden withdrawal feels like rejection. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looks like. Someone pulling back right when things were getting close, just as you were starting to feel hopeful or connected. But what's really happening runs much deeper than the behavior you're seeing. The truth is, they aren't rejecting you. They're reacting to something that feels far more threatening, emotional closeness. Avoidant behavior is rooted in a fear response. It's not about disinterest or cruelty, it's about protection. At some point in their life, this person learned that vulnerability came with consequences. Maybe they grew up in an environment where emotions weren't safe or where asking for connection was met with punishment, ridicule, or neglect. Over time, their nervous system adapted to survive that environment. They didn't stop needing connection, they just stopped trusting it. And when that's your baseline, closeness doesn't feel warm or inviting. It feels dangerous. That's why avoidants seem calm, even distant, when things are emotionally neutral, but become activated, sometimes even overwhelmed, when intimacy deepens. When someone shows care, consistency, or genuine interest, it creates internal chaos. Their nervous system reads closeness as a potential threat to their independence or safety, and their first instinct is to self-protect. They create space. They go silent. They pull away. This is not because they don't want connection. It's because they don't know how to stay in it without feeling like they're losing themselves or risking emotional pain. To understand this more clearly, it helps to recognize how fear operates in the brain. Fear doesn't always show up as panic or screaming. Sometimes it looks like detachment. It looks like a calm, cool exterior with a storm underneath. Avoidants are often masters of control. They've spent years managing their environment to prevent emotional overload. So when a relationship starts to deepen, their fear doesn't shout. It whispers. It nudges them to take space, to focus on work, to question whether this person is for them. These are all subtle escape hatches that allow them to regulate overwhelming feelings by creating distance. And here's where it gets really complicated. Most avoidants aren't consciously aware that this is fear. They don't wake up thinking, I'm afraid of connection today. Instead, they genuinely believe they're just not ready and not feeling it or need more time. Their behavior feels rational to them, finds logical reasons to justify the distance because admitting its fear would require them to confront old wounds they've spent years avoiding. In many ways, they are just as confused by their reactions as the people who care about them are. This is why trying to chase, convince, or reason with someone who is pulling away almost never works. You're not dealing with logic. You're dealing with a nervous system in defense mode. And when someone feels threatened, even by something as beautiful as intimacy, no amount of persuasion can override their internal alarms. In fact, the more you pursue, the more they retreat. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because their system is hardwired to interpret closeness as risk and pressure as danger. This isn't about blaming avoidance either. It's about compassion. Imagine living in a world where love feels like a trap, where needing someone feels like weakness, and where expressing vulnerability feels like a setup for abandonment. That's the emotional landscape avoidants live in. Their fear isn't irrational, it's historical. It's based on real experiences that taught them connection could cost them their safety, their autonomy, or their sense of control. And yet, here's the paradox, they still long for connection. Deep down, most avoidants want love just as much as anyone else. They want to feel understood, supported, and chosen. But that longing is buried under layers of protective behavior. It shows up in brief moments of openness, followed by abrupt withdrawal. It's the mixed signals, the hot and cold pattern, the confusion they create, both for themselves and for others. They want the connection, but they don't feel safe keeping it. So when you see an avoidant person run from closeness, the most powerful thing you can do is stop taking it as a personal rejection. It's not about your worth or your efforts, it's about their wiring. The fear behind the silence isn't about you. It's about what closeness awakens in them. When you understand that, you stop chasing and you start leading with grounded presence. You become the calm in their storm, not another source of pressure or panic. And that's when something begins to shift, not instantly, but gradually, from fear to safety, from running to staying. Understanding the fear behind the silence is the first step to changing the dance. It's not about fixing them or waiting endlessly. It's about seeing clearly, responding wisely, and deciding what you need, with compassion for their experience and respect for your own. Because once you stop trying to force connection and start creating safety, not just for them, but for yourself, the entire story begins to change. When we think of closeness in a relationship, we often associate it with comfort, love, and security. For most people, emotional intimacy is something that feels good, a sign that things are working, deepening, growing. But for someone with avoidant attachment, closeness doesn't feel safe. It feels threatening. And that threat isn't just in their mind, it's in their body. Their nervous system is wired to experience intimacy not as a reward, but as a risk. This happens because of early relational patterns. Avoidant individuals usually grow up in environments where emotional needs were minimized, ignored, or even punished. When a child consistently experiences emotional attunement as unavailable or conditional, they learn to rely on themselves. Asking for support didn't yield safety. It created vulnerability. So over time, the child adapts by disconnecting from their own emotional needs. They stop reaching out. They stop expecting others to be there. And eventually, they stop trusting that closeness will bring anything other than disappointment or pain. This adaptation becomes a blueprint. As adults, avoidants often look independent, self-sufficient, and emotionally composed. But underneath, their emotional world is guarded. They've learned to feel safe by being in control of their environment, their feelings, and especially their connections. So when a relationship starts to become emotionally close, when someone starts showing real interest, vulnerability, or emotional depth, the avoidant partner's alarm system kicks in. This isn't about rational thought. It's an automatic survival response. Closeness triggers a buried belief. This is where I get hurt. That's why intimacy, the very thing they may crave deep down, feels suffocating to them. When someone leans in emotionally, the avoidant doesn't interpret it as love. They interpret it as pressure. Their system is scanning for signs of enmeshment, control, or impending disappointment. So instead of relaxing into closeness, they brace against it. It's not that they don't feel something, it's that feeling something makes them feel out of control. And when you've spent your whole life keeping your emotional world tightly contained, the loss of control feels intolerable. What's even more confusing is that this reaction isn't always visible on the surface. Avoidants don't necessarily look anxious or upset. Their detachment can appear calm, rational, even confident. But internally, they're overwhelmed. Emotional closeness activates discomfort they've spent a lifetime trying to suppress. So they distance themselves. They shut down. They shift from warmth to coldness, from engagement to avoidance, not because they want to hurt you, but because closeness feels like it's closing in on them. This explains why avoidants often pull away after moments of connection. You might have a deep conversation, share something vulnerable, or experience a moment of real intimacy, and then suddenly they're gone. They cancel plans. They take longer to respond. They seem emotionally unavailable. It's not because the connection meant nothing to them. It's because it meant something, and that something triggered all their old protective instincts. In their world, closeness equals exposure, and exposure feels like danger. Think of it like a turtle retreating into its shell. Not because it hates the light, but because the light feels unsafe. This internal conflict creates a cycle. They move toward connection until it gets too close, then retreat to regain a sense of safety. And that back and forth can leave their partner confused, hurt, and doubting their own worth. It's important to understand that avoidants aren't choosing this reaction out of malice. Their avoidance is a reflex, not a strategy. It's how they learned to survive relationships that didn't feel emotionally safe. Their system interprets closeness as something to be managed, not embraced. So when you move closer, emotionally, physically, or energetically, they instinctively move away. not because you did something wrong, but because their system believes closeness comes at a cost. And here's the hardest part. The more consistent and loving you are, the more uncomfortable they might become. Your presence, your availability, your emotional openness, all the things you offer in good faith can feel overwhelming to someone who never learned how to receive those things safely. That's the tragedy of avoidant attachment. The very things they need to heal, emotional connection, trust, vulnerability, are the very things that activate their defenses. So how do you deal with this? First, by realizing that you can't fix someone's wiring with love alone. No matter how patient, kind, or open-hearted you are, you can't override someone's nervous system. But you can stop personalizing their reaction. Their withdrawal isn't a rejection of you. It's a reflection of what closeness brings up in them. When you understand that, you stop trying to manage their responses and start focusing on your own boundaries, needs, and emotional clarity. Secondly, safety must be mutual. The goal isn't to walk on eggshells to avoid triggering the avoidant. The goal is to create an environment where both people feel safe, to show up honestly, to express needs without fear, to set limits without guilt. That starts with understanding the internal conflict avoidants face, but also with refusing to abandon your own emotional truth to accommodate it. Ultimately, closeness feels like a threat to avoidance because it represents the unknown, a space where control is lost, where feelings rise, and where old wounds can be exposed. But it's also the only space where true connection can grow. The challenge for both people is to meet that space with awareness, patience, and a willingness to grow. Not by forcing closeness, but by learning how to stay with the discomfort without running from it. Because the only way out of fear is through it, one safe, honest, regulated step at a time. The push-pull dynamic is one of the most confusing and emotionally draining patterns in a relationship, especially when one person has avoidant attachment tendencies. It creates a cycle where connection and distance seem to exist on a loop. Just when things start to feel close or emotionally fulfilling, the avoidant partner begins to withdraw. Then, when space is given or the other person starts to step back, the avoidant partner re-engages, often showing interest, warmth, or even affection. This rhythm of closeness and retreat becomes the emotional heartbeat of the relationship, and it can leave both people feeling unsure, frustrated, and deeply misunderstood. At the core of this dynamic is an internal conflict within the avoidant person. They want connection. They may even crave it, but they fear what that connection might cost them. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, intimacy often triggers feelings of vulnerability, loss of control, or a fear of being engulfed. On one hand, they're drawn to the comfort and safety of closeness. On the other, their nervous system is wired to equate that closeness with a threat to their independence or emotional safety. So they begin to oscillate between pulling in and pushing away, caught in a pattern that feels both necessary and exhausting. When the relationship starts to deepen and emotional intimacy grows, the avoidant partner feels exposed. Their initial response might not be obvious. They don't always slam the door or disappear overnight. Often, the shift is subtle. Their texts become less frequent, their tone more reserved, their availability suddenly limited. They may become critical or nitpicky, focusing on small problems as a way to create emotional distance. These behaviors are not acts of cruelty. They are unconscious strategies to regain a sense of control. The avoidant person feels emotionally flooded, and their way of coping is to step back, to reestablish the distance that feels safe to them. This is where the blend of push and part of the dynamic takes place. When they feel too close, they push their partner away emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically. The partner, often someone with anxious or secure tendencies, experiences this retreat as confusion or abandonment. They don't understand why someone who seemed so connected yesterday is now cold or distant. In response, they may try harder to bridge the gap. They reach out more, seek reassurance, or attempt to talk through the disconnection. But this increased effort can feel overwhelming to the avoidant partner, who interprets it as pressure or intrusion. That, in turn, causes them to withdraw even more. Eventually, the partner gets tired of chasing. They begin to accept, or at least mimic, the avoidance distance. They stop texting, stop initiating conversations, and pull their energy back. And then something interesting happens. The avoidant person starts to feel the absence. They may not consciously miss the connection in the same way, but they notice the shift. The space they created no longer feels like relief. It starts to feel like disconnection or loss. And because the pressure has lifted, they feel safe enough to come closer again. They may reach out, express interest, suggest spending time together, or show affection in small ways. This is the pull. In this moment, the relationship feels good again. There's a sense of reconnection, a spark of hope. But the cycle hasn't truly been broken. It's just reset. As intimacy builds again, the avoidant partner begins to feel emotionally crowded, and the pattern repeats. The closeness triggers their defenses, and they push away once more. Over time, this creates a deeply destabilizing experience for both partners. One person feels constantly abandoned, and the other feels constantly overwhelmed. The tragedy of the push-pull dynamic is that both people often want the same thing, a secure, loving connection. But their emotional blueprints, especially the avoidant partner's fear of intimacy and need for space, make it difficult to maintain that connection over time. What's more painful is that neither side fully understands the other's perspective. The partner may interpret the avoidant's distance as lack of love or interest, while the avoidant interprets the partner's pursuit as pressure or neediness. Each person is reacting to the other in ways that reinforce the exact fears they're trying to avoid. Breaking this cycle requires a high degree of self-awareness, especially from the avoidant partner. They need to begin recognizing the fear that drives their distancing behaviors and understand that their discomfort with closeness doesn't mean the relationship is wrong. It means their old wounds are being activated. For the partner on the receiving end of the push-pull, it requires learning how to hold space without overextending. That means not chasing, not shrinking, but also not punishing. Just staying grounded in your own emotional reality while allowing the other person to process theirs. The push-pull dynamic doesn't have to define a relationship forever, but it won't resolve on its own. It requires both people to move out of reactivity and into conscious action. The avoidant must learn to stay in connection even when it feels uncomfortable, and the partner must learn to create emotional safety without sacrificing self-respect. When that happens, the dynamic begins to shift from a cycle of fear to a dance of trust. And that's when real intimacy can finally begin. When we talk about creating lasting connection with someone who has avoidant attachment, most people focus on strategy, what to say, how much space to give, how long to wait before texting back. But what actually makes the biggest difference isn't technique, it's safety. Emotional safety is the foundation for every healthy relationship, and for someone with avoidant tendencies, it's the only thing that can slowly start to override their deep-seated fear of intimacy. Without safety, connection feels threatening. With it, connection becomes possible, not all at once, but piece by piece. For the avoidant person, closeness triggers a physiological stress response. This isn't just about beliefs or attitudes, it's about how their nervous system is wired. When they sense emotional intensity, when someone gets too close too fast, or when their independence feels at risk, their body goes into self-protective mode. They're not trying to hurt anyone, they're trying to regulate themselves. And often, they do that by shutting down or withdrawing. What they need in those moments isn't pressure or proof, they need safety. But not the kind of safety that's performative or manipulative. They need real emotional steadiness, a calm presence that doesn't flinch, doesn't chase, and doesn't take their distancing personally. Many people make the mistake of trying to unmanage the avoidant person. They think that if they say the right words, act detached enough, or show just enough interest but not too much, it will somehow make the avoidant stay. But this kind of strategic behavior, even if well-intentioned, is actually counterproductive. It creates an environment of anxiety, not safety. The avoidant can sense when someone is trying to control the outcome or manipulate the timing of closeness. And because their core fear is being engulfed or emotionally cornered, they respond to that energy by pulling away even more. So ironically, the harder someone works to keep them close, the more unsafe it feels. The turning point comes when the other person stops trying to get a response and starts focusing on being a grounded, emotionally self-regulated presence. This doesn't mean tolerating bad behavior or pretending indifference. It means you stop personalizing the pushback and start holding your emotional center. You remain calm, clear, and consistent, not to win them over, but because that's who you are. This creates an environment where the avoidant person can begin to lower their guard. Not because they're being convinced, but because their nervous system starts to trust that closeness won't cost them their autonomy. Emotional safety also means consistency without pressure. It means showing up as reliable without demanding constant proof of connection. For someone with avoidant attachment, even subtle forms of expectation can feel overwhelming. If they sense that your mood or behavior changes based on how close they are, they experience that as emotional unpredictability. But when they see that your emotional state remains steady, whether they are drawing near or pulling back, it begins to register as safe. They learn slowly that they don't have to disappear in order to feel okay, that intimacy doesn't have to mean sacrifice or control. And this realization, even if unconscious at first, is what begins to shift the dynamic. But creating safety doesn't just benefit the avoidant, it protects you too. When you are rooted in your own emotional regulation, you stop riding the roller coaster of their responses. You're not pulled into panic when they withdraw or overly elated when they come closer. You start to lead with grounded presence instead of reactivity. And that steadiness changes everything. It's what breaks the cycle of anxious pursuit and avoidant retreat. It introduces a new pattern, one where both people are allowed to be human, messy, and in process, without either one needing to be perfect or perform. This is also where boundaries come in, not as threats or ultimatums, but as extensions of emotional clarity. Boundaries are part of what makes an environment feel safe. They let both people know what's okay and what's not. For the avoidant, clear and respectful boundaries help define the space within which connection can exist without pressure. For the partner, boundaries are a way of staying self-connected, of knowing where your limits are and honoring your own needs, even while creating space for the avoidant to come forward on their own terms. Ultimately, this point is about shifting from strategy to safety, from trying to get closeness to creating an environment where closeness can grow. That means regulating your own nervous system, understanding your own triggers, and relating from a place of calm clarity rather than emotional urgency. When you embody that kind of emotional safety, you stop reinforcing the avoidance fears. You become the exception to their pattern, not by fixing them, not by waiting endlessly, but by being the kind of presence that doesn't need to control connection to feel secure. And in that space, real intimacy can begin to take root, not rushed, not forced, but real. One of the most misunderstood aspects of dealing with avoidant individuals is the belief that if you just love them hard enough, they'll eventually change. That if you stay long enough, remain patient enough, and never give up on them, they'll wake up one day and finally stop running. But the truth is much harder to accept. You cannot force someone to meet you emotionally if they are not willing or ready. You can't love someone into healing if they are not actively choosing to heal. And clinging to the idea that your love will be the exception only leads to a slow erosion of your own self-worth. Avoidant attachment isn't a light switch that flips when someone realizes what they've lost. It's a deeply rooted pattern formed in childhood tied to safety, survival, and emotional regulation. It doesn't change just because you show up consistently or prove you're different. In fact, those attempts, while well-meaning, often backfire. The avoidance system interprets emotional pursuit, even loving pursuit, as pressure. And pressure is the one thing they've spent their entire life avoiding. So the more you try to hold on, the more they need to pull away to feel safe. This creates a painful loop where your efforts to connect are misread as demands, and their withdrawal feels like rejection. You start believing that if you were just a little more calm, more understanding, more detached, they would finally stay. And that's where you start to lose yourself. You begin shrinking your emotional needs to keep the peace. You stop expressing your truth for fear of pushing them away. You start to live in reaction to their avoidance rather than in alignment with your own heart. And that is not love. That is survival mode disguised as devotion. Real love isn't about convincing someone to show up for you. It's about mutual emotional availability, about two people being willing to meet in the middle and do the uncomfortable work of building trust together. If one person is constantly reaching while the other is retreating, that's not partnership. That's a trauma pattern. And if you keep participating in that dynamic, hoping it will eventually change, you may find yourself stuck in a cycle of hope and heartbreak for years. You'll get just enough connection to stay invested, but never enough to feel secure. The hardest thing to accept is that no matter how good your intentions are, you cannot fix someone else's emotional wounds. You cannot teach them how to stay if they are committed to running. You cannot be soft enough to melt their armor if they're not willing to even look at why they wear it. Their healing is their responsibility. And waiting for someone to be ready, while admirable in theory, often becomes a way of avoiding your own readiness. Your readiness to be in a relationship where you're met, valued, and loved with the same energy you give. It's important to stop mistaking emotional unavailability for mystery or depth. Just because someone has layers doesn't mean they're healthy to peel back. Some people are not emotionally available because they've chosen not to be. Because staying disconnected gives them control, and control gives them a false sense of safety. Your love won't convince them otherwise. Only their willingness to confront their own discomfort will lead to any real transformation. And until that day comes, if it ever comes, you have to stop abandoning yourself in the name of being understanding. Choosing to walk away from someone who won't meet you isn't giving up on them. It's choosing to stop giving up on yourself. It's recognizing that your desire for connection is not a burden, that your emotional needs are not too much, and that love is not supposed to feel like constant confusion. Healthy love is reciprocal. It involves risk and effort from both people. If you're the only one willing to be vulnerable, to initiate hard conversations, to bridge emotional gaps, then you're not in a relationship. You're in an emotional project. This is not to demonize avoidance. Many of them are deeply caring people who simply haven't learned how to feel safe in closeness. But that doesn't make them your responsibility. It doesn't mean you should stay in a dynamic that chips away at your self-esteem. You can have compassion for someone's wounds without turning yourself into collateral damage. You can honor their struggles and still honor your own emotional truth, which is that you deserve to feel chosen, not chased. You deserve to feel held, not tolerated. Eventually, you realize that love isn't about endurance, it's about alignment. It's not about proving your worth by staying through dysfunction. It's about recognizing when the dynamic is harming you and having the courage to choose differently. Because the longer you stay in a relationship where your needs are unmet, the more you teach yourself that your needs don't matter. And the more you silence your truth, the harder it becomes to hear it. Letting go of the hope that someone will change is heartbreaking, but it's also the beginning of your healing. It's the moment you stop asking for crumbs and start claiming the feast of love you deserve, not from someone else, but from yourself. And when you begin honoring your worth in that way, you create space for a different kind of love, one that doesn't need to be earned, chased, or fixed, one that meets you right where you are. The moment you stop chasing is the moment everything begins to shift. Not just in your relationship with the avoidant person, but in your relationship with yourself. Chasing doesn't always look like dramatic displays of desperation. It can be subtle. It's the overthinking before sending a text, the constant analyzing of their words and silences, the way you adapt your needs to maintain their comfort. It's the way you stretch yourself thin trying to seem easygoing when you're hurting inside. Chasing is any behavior rooted in the fear of loss, fear that if you don't show up a certain way, they'll disappear for good. But the truth is, that kind of pursuit doesn't create closeness. It deepens the imbalance. It reinforces the dynamic where one person holds emotional power while the other tiptoes around connection, hoping not to scare them off. Avoidants don't respond to being chased because chasing feels like pressure, and pressure, to them, is danger. When you lean in too hard, they lean out further. When you overinvest, they undercommit. It's not always conscious or malicious, but it's how they protect themselves. Your pursuit, no matter how gentle or loving, triggers their instinct to retreat. So the more you try to connect, the more they disappear. And in that process, you start to lose your sense of self. You begin orienting your emotional world around their availability. Their silence becomes a test. Their withdrawal becomes a challenge. And your identity starts to shrink inside the story of whether or not they will stay. But the real power, your power, comes when you step back from that cycle. When you stop responding to their distance with pursuit and start responding with presence, when you recognize that your value is not dependent on their attention. The moment you stop chasing is the moment you reclaim your center. It's not a punishment or a strategy. It's not the silent treatment in disguise. It's a sacred act of returning to yourself. It's saying, I love you, I care for you, but I will not abandon myself to keep you close. This shift changes the energy entirely. When you no longer move from fear, the avoidant person can feel that. The dynamic that once felt overwhelming to them begins to soften. Your presence no longer feels like a demand, it feels like an invitation. And that invitation is easier to receive when it's not wrapped in urgency. Paradoxically, the space you create by stepping back often becomes the very thing that allows them to come forward. But here's the key. You don't step back for them to come closer. You step back because you're choosing peace over confusion, clarity over chaos, self-respect over self-abandonment. In that space, you begin to see things more clearly. You see how much energy you've spent trying to decode their patterns. You notice how often you've ignored your own needs to maintain harmony. You feel the weight of trying to prove you're safe, worthy, lovable, all things you never had to prove in the first place. And as that clarity comes, so does grief. Grief for the version of you that thought love meant working harder, giving more, staying longer. Grief for the time you spent waiting for someone to finally pick you. But this grief isn't weakness, it's release. It's you shedding the story that said you had to earn love by overextending. Once you stop chasing, you create room for discernment. You start asking better questions. Not how do I get them to stay, but does this relationship honor who I truly am? Not. If I lose them. But what am I losing by holding on? You become less interested in potential and more devoted to reality. And maybe the avoidant person rises to meet you, chooses growth, and opens up. Or maybe they don't. Either way, you've already won because you've chosen alignment over attachment. You've chosen to relate from fullness instead of fear. The beauty of stopping the chase is that you don't stop loving, you just stop leaking. You keep your heart open, but you stop pouring it into places where it can't be held. You remain compassionate, but you draw the line between empathy and self-neglect. You become rooted in your own energy again. And from that place, everything changes. You attract different experiences. You set new standards. You hold space for people who don't just tolerate your emotional depth, but are drawn to it. At its core, this isn't about avoidance at all. It's about you, about how you show up for yourself when love feels uncertain, about how you stop chasing what you never had to chase. Love is not something you earn by abandoning yourself. It's something that grows when both people feel safe enough to stay present, open, and real. And when you stop chasing, you're no longer just waiting for someone else to choose you. You're finally choosing yourself. Not from bitterness, not from defense, but from the quiet, unwavering knowing that you are already enough. At the heart of it all, this isn't just a message about avoidant attachment. It's a wake-up call for anyone who's ever poured themselves into someone emotionally unavailable, hoping love would be enough to make them stay. What you've been chasing isn't just connection with them. It's safety, certainty, and the feeling of being chosen. But here's the truth. The most powerful shift happens when you stop trying to earn love through effort and start embodying it through self-respect. When you realize that real connection isn't built through pursuit or persuasion, but through alignment, emotional presence, and mutual willingness. You don't have to keep proving your worth to people who can't hold it. You don't have to contort yourself to be lovable. You already are. And when you stop abandoning yourself in the name of love, you'll find the kind of love that doesn't run, the kind that meets you, the kind that stays, but it starts with you. It starts the moment you choose yourself, fully, unapologetically, and for good.